The room went dead silent when he said it. "Just another burnout nurse," Gerald Mercer muttered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear but loud enough for her to know he meant it. He stood at the window of his transit authority office, watching Laura Bennett wait at the Route 15 bus stop outside Metro General, her faded scrubs visible beneath a worn denim jacket. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know that 3 hours from now, she would save a man's life with a ballpoint pen. He didn't know she'd held 12 soldiers in her arms as they bled out in Tikrit. He only saw what he always saw, someone who didn't belong to his world, standing on his bus stop, waiting for his bus. It was November, and Denver was cold in that particular way that made the air itself taste like winter. The kind of cold that cut through layers and reminded everyone that their bodies were temporary, fragile things. Laura Bennett stood at the metal bench outside the Metro General Emergency Department entrance, holding a cardboard coffee cup that had gone lukewarm sometime during her commute. The cup was from the hospital cafeteria, generic brown cardboard with a logo faded almost to nothing. She'd been making the same cup of coffee the same way for 18 years. Black. No sugar. Drink it while it's still hot or don't drink it at all. That was the philosophy that carried her through double shifts and understaffed ERs and patients who came in broken and left fixed or didn't leave at all. Her hands, when she wrapped them around the cup, showed her history in scars. Burn marks from a field surgical kit that overheated in the Tikrit heat. A thin white line along her index finger from a suture needle that went deeper than it should have. Calluses on her palms that came from 17 years of pushing chest compressions hard enough to crack ribs and save lives. She wore no rings. No bracelets. Nothing that could catch on sterile gloves or get in the way. Her wrists were bare except for a hospital ID badge that said L. Bennett, RN, and a white watch with a scratched crystal face, the kind you could find in any hospital supply closet, the kind no one noticed. The bus stop bench was metal and cold and uncomfortable in that intentional way, designed to prevent anyone from actually wanting to sit there. Laura stood rather than sat, her weight shifted slightly to her left leg, her right leg loose and ready. A habit. A stance that let her move in any direction instantly if the situation required it. She'd been standing like that for 3 years, ever since she'd taken the job at Metro General under a civilian identity, ever since her records had been sealed and classified and filed away in a Pentagon basement under national security provisions that came with a number designation instead of her name. Beside her on the bench sat Marcus Webb. Marcus was mid-50s, with the kind of weathered face that belonged to someone who'd lived outside for stretches of time, someone who'd slept on hard ground and woken up knowing it might be his last morning. He didn't speak. Hadn't spoken since an IED explosion in Tikrit had severed something in his vocal cords that surgery couldn't quite fix. What it had left behind was partial paralysis and tremors that made his hands shake the way old men's hands shake, involuntary, constant, a physical reminder that his body no longer obeyed him the way it once had. He communicated through a small spiral notepad he kept in the inside pocket of his jacket. The pages were worn soft from being folded and refolded. The ink had faded in places where he'd written the same phrases over and over. Thank you. Route 15. Weather nice. Have a good day. Simple things. The kind of things that didn't require the complexity of actual speech. He was trying to write something now, his hands trembling so badly that the pencil jumped across the paper in jagged lines that didn't quite spell anything readable. Laura glanced at the notepad without staring. She'd learned the art of noticing things while appearing not to notice. It was useful in emergency rooms. It was essential in other work. She could read the shakiness in his hands the way a musician reads sheet music, each tremor told a story. Nerve damage, probably peripheral neuropathy. Medication side effects, maybe. Or just the simple fact of being a body that had survived something that should have killed it and was still paying the price every single day. She knew that price intimately. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second, and something passed between them. A recognition that had no name. Laura's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She looked away first, back toward the street where the Route 15 bus wouldn't arrive for another 7 minutes according to the digital sign across the street. Her left hand moved unconsciously to her jacket, her fingers finding the inside lining where the unit patch was sewn. Just a faded piece of fabric, stitched into the hem so carefully that no one would ever notice it unless they were looking. She touched it the way other people touched religious medals or talismans, not quite believing it could help, but unable to stop doing it anyway. The patch was Special Forces. 7th Special Forces Group. From a time when she wore a rank and had a name and operated under the authority of orders that came from people with stars on their shoulders. That was 3 years ago. That was another life. That was before everything got classified, before her personnel file got marked erased, before she became a burnout nurse pushing meds and holding hands and pretending that saving one life in an emergency room was enough purpose to fill an entire existence. Marcus finally got the words written. Thanks. He held up the notepad, showing it to Laura with that tentative expression of someone who'd learned to apologize for his own existence. Just one word. Just a thank you for standing there, for acknowledging his presence, for treating him like a human being instead of an inconvenience. Laura nodded. That was all she offered. A single, clear nod. But she held his gaze for half a second longer than was socially necessary, and that half second carried the weight of everything she couldn't say. She understood what he was. She understood what he'd been. She understood the particular loneliness of being invisible to a world that had once called you essential. What Laura didn't know was that Marcus Webb had served in Tikrit. What she didn't know was that he'd been stationed with the same unit, the same FOB, the same sector of operations where she'd run classified extraction missions that officially never happened. And what she didn't know, not yet, was that Marcus Webb had been the commanding officer who held her son Ryan as he died. Captain Ryan Bennett, 24 years old, hemorrhaging from an IED strike that came down 6 hours before the extraction team could get there. Marcus had pressed his hands against the wound and whispered lies about how everything was going to be okay. Marcus had been the last person Ryan saw before the blood loss took him somewhere beyond pain. Laura didn't know any of this yet. But something in her body recognized him anyway. Some cellular memory that predated language and logic. Some part of her nervous system that said, this is the man. This is the person connected to the worst thing that ever happened. From the glass window of his transit office 20 feet away, Gerald Mercer watched all of this without understanding any of it. He saw a tired nurse in worn scrubs. He saw a trembling old man who probably wasn't sober. He saw a moment of human contact that meant nothing to anyone but them, and he marked it mentally as another irregularity, another small deviation from the order he worked so hard to maintain. Mercer was the kind of man who built his entire identity on enforcement. 63 years old, never married, never served in the military but intensely respectful of the military's hierarchy and order. He'd been a transit authority supervisor for 19 years. Before that, he'd worked municipal parking enforcement. Before that, he'd been the kind of student who reported other students for dress code violations. He was standing at that window because he always stood at that window between 9 and 9:30 in the morning. It was his observation period. The time when he could watch the commuters and identify problems before they became incidents. The woman in the scrubs had caught his attention 3 weeks ago when she'd helped an elderly passenger with an oversized bag without being asked. Mercer had filed a note about it, informal assistance provided to passenger. Potential liability issue if injury occurs. He was the kind of supervisor who saw helpfulness as a lack of professional boundaries. 3 teenagers arrived at the bus stop. Mercer recognized them from previous mornings. They had that particular brand of confidence that came from knowing they'd never faced real consequences. They moved through the bus stop like they owned it, dropping backpacks on the ground, talking too loudly about things no one had asked them about. The kind of energy that came from having nothing better to do and no particular awareness that their behavior affected other people. One of them noticed Marcus trying to write. The noticing was instant and calculated. The teenager elbowed his friend and pointed, his mouth already forming words that would be cruel before he'd fully finished thinking them. This was the moment when everything should have been different. This was the moment when someone should have stepped in. This was the moment when a random Tuesday morning at a bus stop outside a hospital should have stayed routine and unremarkable. But standing at that bus stop was a woman whose hands had held lives together through careful precision. A woman whose mind could calculate trajectories and risk assessments and tactical possibilities in the space of a single breath. A woman who'd forgotten more about violence and survival than most people would ever learn. And standing in his office window was a man who had no idea he was about to trigger a series of events that would end his career and expose secrets the Pentagon had spent 3 years trying to keep buried. The morning was about to become very different. The silence at the bus stop was about to shatter. And the quiet nurse who'd been waiting for Route 15 was about to become something far more dangerous than Gerald Mercer's paperwork could ever anticipate. The tallest teenager, Derek, was already laughing before Laura even turned to look at him. He had Marcus pinned with his eyes, the kind of stare that turns a person into a target, and he was making a show of it. Derek's hands shot up, mimicking the tremor in Marcus's grip, exaggerating the shake into something grotesque, something that looked less like a tremor and more like he was having a seizure right there at the bus stop. "Yo, what's wrong with Shaky?" Derek's voice cut across the concrete like a knife. "He having a seizure or something?" His friends erupted. 2 of them, Alyssa and someone Laura didn't know by name, fed off the energy like hyenas circling. The laughter was cruel, the kind that leaves marks you can't see. Marcus hunched forward, pressing his notepad against his chest like it was armor. His breathing quickened. The tremor in his hands got worse when he was anxious, a cascade of neurological feedback that his own body betrayed him with every time he was scared. He tried to ignore them. That was his strategy, had been his strategy for 3 years, but ignoring predators only made them bolder. Alyssa leaned closer, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Can't you talk? What are you, stupid?" She snapped her fingers near Marcus's face, 3 sharp cracks that sounded like gunshots in the morning air. Marcus flinched hard, his whole body recoiling. The notepad slipped in his grip. Laura felt something shift in her chest. Not anger. Something colder than that. Something that had a long history and a rank and 3 tours of the worst places on Earth. She stood. Her movement was smooth, no urgency, no drama. She simply stepped forward and placed herself between the teenagers and Marcus, her body a wall. The morning light caught the edge of her jaw, and for just a moment, her posture changed, shoulders back, stance widened, hands unclenched. The nurse in the worn jacket disappeared. Something else entirely took her place. "Leave him alone." Her voice was quiet. Not angry. That was the dangerous part. Anger is loud. This was the sound of something that had already made decisions. Derek turned to her with mock surprise, his face breaking into a grin that was all teeth and no warmth. "Oh, look, Shaky's got a girlfriend. What's she gonna do, take our temperature?" His friends laughed harder, bolder now, emboldened by the appearance of a new target. Derek stepped closer to Laura, testing boundaries the way bullies do. "You a nurse or something? Bet you give real gentle shots, huh?" The insult hung in the air between them. Laura didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't react in any way that would give him the satisfaction he was hunting for. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world has to offer. Her eyes were steady, unmoved, the color of a stormy Atlantic in winter. That's when Gerald Mercer emerged from his office. He was in his 50s, expensive watch catching the sun, the kind of man who confused a clipboard with authority and a title with power. Transit Authority Supervisor, the words on his badge meant less to him than what he'd convinced himself they meant. He stormed across the pavement toward the commotion, his face already flushed with the righteous anger of a man about to prove he mattered. But he didn't walk toward Derek. He didn't address the teenagers at all. His fury, his entire focus, swung directly onto Laura like a floodlight. "Are you causing a disturbance at my bus stop?" His voice was sharp, accusatory, the tone reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. Up close, she could smell the coffee on his breath, cheap stuff from the break room, and something else, the acrid scent of someone's aggression, anxiety masked as authority. Laura met his eyes with quiet dignity. "I'm asking them to show basic respect." Mercer's smirk appeared like a scar opening. I don't remember giving you authority to give orders here. This is transit authority property, and I decide what's appropriate. He pulled out his radio without breaking eye contact, his thumb hovering over the button like a threat. Maybe I should call security about aggressive behavior. Your aggressive behavior? The teenager smirked. Derek's confidence surged now that an adult had validated his cruelty. He turned back to Marcus, emboldened, and knocked the notepad directly from Marcus's trembling hands. It fell to the wet pavement, its pages scattering like scattered thoughts, ink bleeding into the moisture. Marcus's breathing hitched. His hands shook worse now, not just tremor anymore but panic, shoulders curling inward, making himself smaller. Laura took one measured breath. Just one. The kind that resets everything, clears the battlefield from your mind, reminds you of the difference between emotion and action. A single tear escaped before she wiped it away with the back of her hand, not looking away from Mercer for even a fraction of a second. The tear was there and then gone, controlled like everything else about her. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Some orders don't require a uniform, she said quietly. Each word was a statement of fact, not a question, not a plea. Mercer's face hardened. His eyes narrowed into something that looked like triumph. He pulled out his clipboard, of course he had a clipboard, men like this always did, and began writing with meticulous, obsessive detail. His pen moved fast, documenting timestamps, Laura's badge number visible on her scrubs, noting her threatening demeanor with the precision of someone building a case he was confident would stick. I'm filing a report on you, lady. Public disturbance. Intimidation of minors. Unauthorized intervention. He was reading from his own internal script, the one that had played in his mind 100 times before. This goes to hospital administration. I have 12 witnesses. He gestured broadly at the small crowd that had gathered, most of whom looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I have your badge number. I have the time. I have everything I need. Mercer was good at this part. The documentation. The bureaucratic weaponization. He understood that written records had power that words alone did not. He understood that the right complaint, filed with the right people, in the right format, could end careers. Men like this didn't need physical weapons. They had forms and procedures and the confidence that came from knowing their adversaries didn't speak their language. Laura bent down and picked up Marcus's notepad, handing it back to him gently. Her hands were steady. Surgeon's hands. Hands that had held lives together in operating tents in Tikrit, hands that had cradled her son, hands that had learned to separate what they felt from what they needed to do. She pressed the notepad back into Marcus's grip and he held it like a lifeline. The bus was approaching in the distance, Route 15, its diesel engine rumbling as it slowed for the stop. Mercer continued his documentation, adding details, cross-referencing, building his paper trail with the precision of someone who believed bureaucracy was more powerful than anything else on Earth. But then Marcus's breathing changed. The shift was subtle but immediate, a catch in his chest, a gasp that came from somewhere deeper than lungs. His hand flew to his sternum. His other hand reached for Laura, fingers scrabbling at her jacket sleeve. His lips were turning blue. Laura's entire demeanor shifted in the space of 1 second. The careful composure, the calculated restraint, the nurse who had been pretending to be helpless, all of it vanished like it had never existed. Her eyes cleared into something clinical and immediate. She moved without hesitation, without asking permission, without caring what Mercer was writing down. She knelt beside Marcus, her hands already assessing, checking his pulse at his neck, listening to his breathing, feeling the tension in his chest wall. Her fingers moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, someone for whom this was muscle memory and instinct fused into a single, lethal competence. Tension pneumothorax, she said quietly, not to anyone in particular, more to herself, a diagnosis delivered with absolute certainty. His lung is collapsing. He needs decompression or he's going to arrest. Marcus's breathing became shallower, more desperate. His color was going gray. The small crowd gasped collectively. Bystanders froze. One teenager pulled out a phone to record. Mercer stood with his clipboard, suddenly uncertain, his authority suddenly feeling very thin. Laura was already moving. She removed her jacket, scanning Marcus's chest with her eyes, locating the landmarks she needed, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. She pulled a pen from her bag, a ballpoint, nothing fancy. Her hands moved with absolute clarity. "I need to decompress his chest or he'll die in 3 minutes," she said. Her voice was different now. The deferential nurse's voice was completely gone. This was command. This was someone who had given orders in combat zones and expected immediate compliance. Mercer stepped forward, his clipboard still in his hands like a shield. "You can't perform medical procedures on transit authority property without authorization. I'm ordering you to step back and wait for the paramedics to." "He'll be dead," Laura interrupted. Not harsh. Just factual. She didn't look up at Mercer. She was already positioning the pen, finding the correct intercostal space by touch and anatomical memory, her fingers moving across Marcus's ribs like she was reading Braille written in an ancient language only she understood. Mercer raised his radio, his voice climbing now, losing its composure. "I'm documenting this. You're performing an unlicensed procedure. This is illegal." Laura performed the needle decompression with the improvised tool. The movement was precise, confident, the movement of someone who had trained for exactly this moment 1,000 times. The pen needle penetrated the chest wall and then, there was the hiss of air escaping, a sound like pressure releasing, like a door opening, like breath itself fleeing the trapped space. Marcus gasped, his color immediately improving from gray back toward something approaching human. His chest expanded. He was breathing again, real breathing, oxygen getting where it needed to go. The small crowd exhaled collectively, like they'd all been holding their breath together. One woman whispered a prayer. Derek's phone lowered slightly, his recording interrupted by shock. Mercer was frantically writing now, documenting angles, photographing the scene with his phone, his voice sharp as he barked into his radio. "I have witnesses to an unauthorized medical intervention in a public space. Medical equipment. Unlicensed procedure performed. Immediate report to hospital administration. And call the police." An ambulance arrived 7 minutes later, paramedics loading Marcus with professional efficiency, thanking Laura without knowing who she really was. But by then Mercer was already on his phone, reading directly from his detailed notes to someone at Metro General Administration, his voice carrying across the pavement, his complaint carefully documented, his case carefully built. He had no idea who he was building a case against. He thought he was filing paperwork. He thought he understood the game. He thought he was playing with someone who didn't know the rules. What happened next changed everything. Marcus gasped. His hand flew to his chest. His lips darkened from pink to blue in 4 seconds flat. Laura saw it instantly. The way his breathing came in shallow, panic bursts. The way his skin color shifted toward cyanosis. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart. He had maybe 8 minutes before cardiac arrest. The bench beside him emptied. Bystanders stepped back, phones rising to record rather than help. An older woman clutched her purse. A teenager laughed nervously. No one moved toward Marcus. Laura moved toward him. She didn't hesitate. Didn't second guess. Didn't wait for permission or protocols or the ambulance that was still 14 minutes out by dispatch. She knelt beside Marcus, her scrubs pulling tight at the knees against the cold concrete. "I need something sharp," she said. Her voice carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "Pen. Now." A woman in a business suit fumbled through her purse and thrust a ballpoint pen at her. Plastic body, metal tip. Not ideal. Better than the 8 minutes Marcus didn't have. Laura's hands moved on their own. Muscle memory from a field station in Tikrit, from a Marine with shrapnel through his anterior mediastinum, from the training that never really leaves your body even when you try to bury it under 3 years of civilian scrubs. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomical landmark she'd learned to feel blind, in the dark, under fire. She twisted the pen apart with 2 fingers. Removed the ink cartridge. The plastic tube was narrow, maybe 14-gauge equivalent. Not a proper needle. But it would let air escape. It would let his lung re-expand. It would keep his heart from being crushed. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Marcus, and she meant it for everything, for being here, for knowing what this meant, for what his hands had witnessed in Tikrit that he couldn't say aloud anymore. The needle went in. The hiss came instantly. Air escaping under pressure. The sound of a lung that had been collapsed, finally getting space to breathe. Marcus's body seized, then relaxed. Color began creeping back into his face. From blue-gray toward human again. His breathing steadied. Became less panicked. Less desperate. Laura stayed beside him, her hand steady on the improvised decompression site, counting his respirations. 16. 14. 12. Normal. His eyes found hers. No words. No sound. But something passed between them, recognition, maybe. Gratitude. The weight of what he'd been carrying. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later. But Gerald Mercer had watched every second from his office window, 50 feet away. Had seen the pen being dismantled. Had seen the procedure. Had seen a nurse in hospital scrubs performing an unauthorized medical intervention on transit property. Had seen his opportunity crystallize like ice in winter. He pulled out his phone before the ambulance doors even closed. Mercer had been documenting since the teenagers had left the bench. He had photos of Laura kneeling. Videos of the procedure. Timestamps. He had already coached statements from the teenagers, rewording their accounts to make Laura sound aggressive, unstable, dangerous. He had annotated the security footage and cross-referenced it with city ordinances about unlicensed medical practice in public spaces. He had built a case the way people like him always built cases, methodical, airtight, weaponized. By 2:38 p.m., his formal complaint had reached Metro General's administration. 43 pages. Signed affidavits. Video evidence. Photographs. A demand for criminal charges. A threat of civil litigation. By 4:15 p.m., Laura was sitting across from Patricia Chen, the hospital's HR director, in a small office with grey carpet and no windows. Chen's desk held a file the thickness of a phone book. Her expression was careful, practiced, the kind HR directors wore when they'd already made the decision and were just following protocol. Laura could see the termination letter already printed on the corner of the desk, waiting for a signature that would erase 7 years of employment in a single stroke. "We received a detailed complaint from Transit Authority Supervisor Gerald Mercer," Chen said, sliding pages across the desk one at a time. Her voice had the rehearsed quality of something read from a legal memo. His citing City Ordinance 47B regarding unlicensed medical procedures in public spaces, Liability Code 12C about hospital staff creating institutional exposure, and Transit Regulation 89F about unauthorized activity on transit property. Laura sat with her hands folded in her lap. She didn't uncross her legs. Didn't lean forward. Didn't perform anger or desperation or any of the emotions that might give someone like Chen purchase to work with. "I saved a man's life," Laura said quietly. "You performed a procedure outside a medical facility without authorization," Chen replied. "Not unkind. Not cruel. Just factual." The kind of tone people used when they'd already calculated the liability and found the answer in their favor. "Mr. Mercer has provided witness statements, photographs, timestamps, and video evidence. He's demanding criminal charges and threatening to sue the hospital for your actions." The file contents were spread before her like an autopsy. Statements from the teenagers: Laura had been erratic, aggressive, seemed to be showing off. Statements from bystanders: she had forced her way in, refused to let emergency services handle it, acted like she was in charge. Photographs of her kneeling beside Marcus, the pen in her hand. Video timestamps annotated with citations of ordinances, regulations, and codes. Mercer's handwriting was meticulous. His analysis was thorough. He had given her nowhere to stand. Mr. Mercer is also alleging you have been harassing him for months, Chen continued, turning another page. That you have a pattern of insubordinate behavior, and that you represent a liability the hospital cannot afford. Laura took one measured breath. The kind of breath that had kept her steady during interrogations, during standoffs, during the moment she'd held her son's hand in a hospital bed 3,000 miles from here and watched him stop breathing. That's not true, she said. Unfortunately, his documentation is extensive. The hospital's legal counsel has advised immediate termination to limit exposure. Chen slid the termination letter across the desk. Standard language. Effective immediately. No severance. No appeal. No negotiation. Laura looked at the letter. At the space for her signature. At the way her 7 years of perfect evaluations and patient commendations and 0 safety incidents had been reduced to a single bureaucratic page in the hands of a man who hated what she represented. She could fight this. Should fight this. She could hire a lawyer. Could demand discovery. Could prove that Marcus Webb was a veteran and that she'd saved his life and that Mercer had fabricated statements and coached witnesses. She could force a trial. She could win. But winning would require pulling her military record. Would require background checks that would expose Captain Laura Bennett, Special Forces. Would require explaining why a woman with 18 years of service had vanished into civilian life 3 years ago under classified orders. Would require admitting that a rescue operation in Tikrit had gone wrong, that soldiers had died, that she'd been erased from official documentation and buried under national security decision directive protocols that meant one phone call from the wrong person would erase everything again. Officially, Captain Laura Bennett no longer existed. Her service record was sealed. Her deployments were redacted. Her identity was a ghost living inside the body of a nurse named Laura Bennett, wearing scrubs instead of body armor, pushing pills instead of pushing through doors in hostile territory. Any legal battle would expose that ghost. She picked up the pen. Her handwriting was steady as she signed the termination letter. No hesitation. No tremor. Just the same controlled precision she'd learned to apply to everything, signing out weapons, signing off on classified briefings, signing away the parts of herself that couldn't exist in daylight. Chen watched her sign. Watched her fold the letter once, then twice. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file, Chen said. The tone was almost apologetic. We're requesting you turn in your badge and access cards by end of business. Laura stood. All right. She didn't ask for a reference. Didn't request copies of her file. Didn't ask about health insurance continuation or final patient handoff protocols. She simply stood, placed the termination letter on Chen's desk with her badge beside it, and walked out of the office without looking back. The hospital corridor stretched before her in that particular fluorescent silence that only exists when the weight of the world has just shifted. Her shoes clicked against the tile, the same rhythm she'd heard in operating theaters, in trauma bays, in the moments before everything changed. 7 years. Hundreds of patients. Thousands of hours standing in blood and fear and the desperate, sacred work of keeping people alive. Gone. Erased by a man who'd seen her defend someone he hated. She walked to her locker. Emptied it into a paper bag. The cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse." The dying succulent from someone's grateful family member. A photo of Ryan in his dress uniform, the son she'd lost and could never publicly honor, whose commanding officer she'd just saved with a pen and muscle memory and the kind of composure that only comes from having nothing left to lose. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining. Still hidden. Still hers. She didn't check back at HR, didn't say goodbye to the nurses she'd trained, the residents she'd mentored, the patients whose names she'd remember for the rest of her life. She simply walked through the emergency department doors at 5:23 p.m., her paper bag under one arm, her jacket zipped against the November cold, and stepped out into a city that suddenly had no place for her? Rain began falling before she reached the bus stop. Not gentle rain. Rain that hammered against the pavement like a closing fist. Like the world was angry at her too. The cardboard box felt weightless in her hands, which meant everything inside it mattered more than physics should allow. Rain drummed against the pavement like Morse code, each drop a syllable in a language only the broken understood. Laura stood at the same bus stop where it had started, where the teenagers laughed, where Marcus Webb's hands trembled on that notepad, where she had made the choice that erased her. The Route 15 wouldn't arrive for another 8 minutes. She knew because she'd checked the transit app 3 times, as if knowing the exact moment of her departure might make it feel less like running. The box contained everything the hospital had permitted her to take: the cracked ceramic mug with its faded lettering, "World's Okayest Nurse," a sad succulent browning at the edges, and a photograph in a silver frame that she hadn't looked at in approximately 4,000 days. Ryan's dress uniform caught the grey light. Full dress blues, the gold buttons polished to mirrors, his neck stiff in the high collar the way it always was in formal photos. He hated that collar. He'd complained about it for 30 minutes before the Marine recruiting photo shoot, and she'd laughed and told him to stand straighter, that looking miserable didn't help his case. That was the last time she remembered laughing with her son before Tikrit took him. Before she held him as he died, 3 years ago, in the arms of his commanding officer. Marcus Webb had been that commanding officer. She set the box on the wet bench, the cardboard already absorbing moisture like it was tired too. The rain fell heavier now, the kind that soaked through military-grade gear if you stood still long enough. Laura had stood still for 36 years. Most of those years classified. The official record said Captain Laura Bennett of Special Forces had never existed. After the extraction in Tikrit went wrong, after the ambush in the Jolan district, after the medevac helicopter took hostile fire, after Ryan's femoral artery opened like a mouth screaming, the Pentagon had made a choice. Her identity was a liability. The operation was classified so deep that even her commanding general couldn't acknowledge she'd been there. So they deleted her. Officially and completely. Given her a new name, a new social security number, a new life that looked nothing like a soldier's. 3 years of silence. 3 years of wearing scrubs instead of body armor, of taking orders from administrators instead of colonels, of keeping the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining as the only evidence that she'd ever been anything but what people saw. Just a nurse. Just someone pushing medications and checking vitals and staying invisible. Except that Marcus Webb had recognized her in an instant. Not from her face. From the way she moved. From the angle of her stance when she positioned herself between him and those teenagers. Muscle memory had told him what her name couldn't, that the woman in the cardboard scrubs was the captain who'd pulled him out of a burning compound when his legs had stopped working, who'd applied a tourniquet to his thigh while rounds chewed through the concrete inches from her skull, who'd whispered coordinates into a dead radio until the medevac actually came. And that recognition had cost her everything. Because saving Marcus meant answering questions. It meant standing at a hospital bed while he wrote on his notepad in those shaking hands, the shaking that came from severed nerves, from the day his spine had twisted wrong, and watching his eyes when they asked her who she was. She couldn't lie. She couldn't say she was just trained in emergency medicine, that the needle decompression was muscle memory from a nursing course. Marcus knew better. He'd watched her perform that procedure with the precision of someone who'd done it before, who'd trained under combat surgeons, who'd saved lives under fire in the kind of darkness where you couldn't see your own hands. The bus stop steel shelter groaned in the wind. Across the street, the VA clinic glowed warm against the grey morning. Veterans inside were probably being helped by people whose records actually existed, whose service could be honored, whose sacrifice could be publicly acknowledged. Laura couldn't be honored. She couldn't even be real. She touched the photograph through the plastic of the box. Ryan's face stayed exactly as it had been, young and stiff and uncomfortable in formal blues, the same expression he'd worn when he swore the oath. She'd been there for that too, in the audience, unable to claim him as her son when anyone asked. Couldn't explain why she was crying. couldn't say his name in public because saying his name meant explaining that she knew him, and explaining that meant admitting she was his mother, and admitting that meant admitting she was someone who shouldn't exist. The rain tasted like copper and ozone. Or maybe that was just memory. Maybe that was what Tikrit had tasted like, the air after the blast, the dust that coated everything including the inside of her lungs, the metallic flavor of a day that had split the world into before and after. A voice cut through the sound of rain. Young. Breathless. Mom. Laura turned. Sophie stood at the edge of the bus shelter, soaked through, her school uniform plastered against her ribs, her dark hair, the color of Ryan's hair, dripping in her eyes. And in her hands, she held a shadow box. Wooden glass, and inside it, arranged in precise rows like medals always are arranged, was the full record of what Captain Laura Bennett had actually done. Sophie, what are you? Laura's voice came out steady. Good. Professional. The voice she used when code blues were happening, and staying calm was the only choice that made sense. Mom, they need to see these. Sophie opened the case like she was opening a door to a room that had been locked for 3 years. The morning light caught the ribbons, each one a color that meant something specific in a language only soldiers spoke. They need to know who you actually are. Inside the box, the silver star with its pale blue ribbon and 5-point star, a bronze star with the distinctive V device indicating valor in combat, 2 purple hearts with their purple silk and gold borders, service ribbon stacked like evidence. All of it authentic. All of it hidden in the back of Laura's closet for 36 months while she worked in a hospital under a fake name and told nobody anything about the 18 years before. The bus stop suddenly had more people in it than it should have. An older man waiting for the Route 15. A woman in a business suit who'd been passing by and stopped. A couple with coffee cups. They gathered the way crowds do when something forbidden is suddenly visible, when something secret becomes public, when the impossible appears right in front of you on a wet morning in Denver. And Gerald Mercer appeared at the edge of the shelter. Of course he did. He'd come back to this bus stop on his morning rounds, probably hoping to see her one more time broken and diminished, carrying cardboard boxes toward whatever life remained for people he'd destroyed. His face when he saw the medals, when he recognized what they meant, shifted through surprise to something harder. Something desperate. "This is stolen valor," he said. His voice had lost the authority it carried in his office. Rain was running down his face and he didn't seem to notice. "Those are fake. You can buy anything online. This is pathetic." Marcus Webb arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by a hospital volunteer. He'd been released that morning, the documentation in his file noting no permanent lung damage thanks to a procedure no licensed physician at Metro General had performed. He moved toward the medals, his trembling hands gripping the wheelchair arms, his eyes locked on Laura's face. His mouth opened and closed like he was working through language his body had forgotten how to make. When the sound came, it was barely a whisper. Hoarse and thin and harder to produce than any scream. 2 words that cut through the rain like coordinates transmitted from a dying radio, Nightingale 6. The call sign hung in the air. Mercer's face went gray. A Marine stepped forward from the crowd, late 30s, jacket with the Corps insignia, face that carried the weight of knowing what combat actually means. He looked at the medals, then at Marcus, then at Laura with the precision of someone recognizing rank even when rank isn't visible. "Nightingale 6, the Marine said quietly. He picked up the shadow box with both hands, the way you carry something sacred. That was the call sign for the Special Forces team leader in Tikrit, 2019. He read the citations aloud. Silver Star. Bronze Star with V. The words had power when spoken by someone who understood what they meant, when heard by a crowd that gradually expanded as more people stopped, as the bus stop became the center of something larger than weather or transportation schedules. A woman in a business suit stepped closer. For gold stars visible on her coat lapel. A voice that carried the kind of authority that shapes continents. "Captain Bennett." Laura didn't answer. Didn't move. Just stood in the rain with a cardboard box at her feet and the photo of her dead son's commanding officer reading his record aloud, and the only person who could have given her permission to be real, staring at her with eyes that saw all the way through the fake name and fake identity and 3 years of staying invisible. General Patricia Vance studied the medals. Then she turned to the growing crowd. This officer led a classified extraction operation that saved an entire Marine reconnaissance unit. Mercer stepped forward, his voice rising. "This is absurd. She performed an unauthorized medical procedure. I have documentation." "You have documentation," General Vance said, her voice dropping into the register that military people use when they're about to end something completely, that you watched an officer save a man's life and you chose to destroy her career instead of honoring her service. The rain kept falling. The Route 15 wouldn't arrive for another 3 minutes. And in those 3 minutes, every lie about who Laura Bennett was dissolved completely into the wet Denver air, leaving nothing but the truth standing in a cardboard box, finally visible, finally real, finally impossible to hide or ignore anymore. The Route 15 wouldn't arrive for another 3 minutes. Sophie pushed through the crowd that had formed at the bus stop, her breathlessness matching her urgency, the shadow box clutched against her chest like an artifact from a museum. She was 17, still in her school jacket, still wearing the kind of fierce determination that only came from understanding what had been taken from your mother. The box was navy blue. The medals inside caught the November light like small stars. Mercer stood at the edge of the gathering, his transit authority uniform suddenly too tight across the shoulders. He'd come back to gloat, the way predators return to the site of a kill, expecting to see only blood. Instead, he'd found a shrine being built in real time. "Mom," Sophie said, breathless, opening the case. The crowd leaned in. Mercer's jaw tightened. Marcus Webb's trembling hand reached toward the medals. His fingers shook, not from age or fear, but from 3 years of forcing his vocal cords to stay silent. Then he whispered, hoarse and broken as a radio with a dying battery, "Nightingale 6. 3 words. That's all it took to change the entire equation." A Marine in the crowd, young, maybe 23, with the kind of bearing that came from understanding hierarchy without needing to announce it, stepped forward. His eyes moved across the citations, each letter precise, each word a legal punch. "Silver Star for Valor under fire," he read aloud, his voice steady as an M16 on a tripod. "Bronze Star with V device for extracting 12 wounded soldiers under enemy fire in Tikrit." He paused. His voice cracked slightly. "Purple Heart. Purple Heart." Mercer's face had gone the color of old concrete. General Patricia Vance pushed through the crowd with the kind of momentum that made people step aside without thinking about why. She'd been at the VA clinic across the street, a routine administrative visit, when someone had called her. Now she stood in uniform, not pressed ceremonial dress, but the kind of worn soft fatigues that suggested a woman who still answered the radio when duty called. Her salute came up clean, precise as a surgeon's cut, her eyes locked on the medals the way some people looked at holy relics. "Captain Bennett," she said, and the use of the rank was a key turning in a lock. The entire bus stop rearranged itself around that single word. "Your service record," Vance began, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 28 years of making decisions that cost lives if they were wrong. Mercer laughed. The sound was wrong, like a car engine grinding, and he held up his hands. "Wait, wait, wait," he said, his voice climbing toward something frantic. "This is all fake. Stolen valor. You can't just show up with a box of medals and..." "We can verify every single one," a voice called from the back of the crowd. That voice belonged to Kevin Chen. Navy veteran, Transit Authority IT specialist, the kind of man who saw patterns in data the way eagles saw movement from 3,000 feet. He'd been the one watching the security feeds last night when Mercer thought no one was looking. He'd seen the supervisor's hand shaking as he attempted to delete the footage from the incident at the bus stop, the footage showing the teenagers being coached, Mercer standing motionless while Marcus collapsed, Mercer photographing Laura instead of calling for medical help. Kevin had saved every frame to an encrypted drive. Then he'd made a phone call to Transit Authority Internal Affairs. Then another to the Denver Police Department's Investigations Unit. Then one more to a journalist at Channel 7 News who specialized in stories about corruption in city agencies. The phone call from Channel 7 had been made at 11:53 p.m. The story ran at 6 a.m. By 7:15 a.m., 3 detectives in unmarked cars had pulled into the Transit Authority administrative offices with a warrant for Mercer's personnel files. "You tried to delete evidence," Kevin said quietly. He was holding his phone out, and the screen showed timestamps, file deletion attempts, recovery traces. "I saved it. All of it. Police have the drive. News has copies. Your attempted cover-up is documented down to the nanosecond." Mercer's face went from concrete grey to something closer to ash. His hand went for his radio, instinct alone, and then he seemed to remember that the radio didn't answer to him anymore, not since 6 a.m. when the suspension notice had been uploaded to his personnel file. "She had no authority to," he started, but his voice had become something thin, something desperate. "She had the authority to save a man's life," the hearing officer said, except there was no hearing officer here, just the collective weight of everyone at the bus stop understanding, all at once, what had been done to Captain Laura Bennett. The accusation. The termination. The careful documentation of nothing. General Vance's salute dropped. She turned to Laura with the kind of regard reserved for those who'd walked through fire and come out carrying someone else. "We'd like you to resume your commission," she said. "Full restoration. Rank and benefits. The Pentagon's authorization is already processed." Laura stood very still. Sophie's hand found hers. The November wind picked up, rattling the bus shelter, and somewhere in the distance, the Route 15 honked its arrival signal, still for minutes out. "Captain Bennett," Marcus whispered again, and the second time the rank came out clearer, less like rust and more like recognition. Mercer tried to back away, but the crowd had formed a perimeter that wasn't quite blocking him but made the message clear: there was nowhere to go. Not today. Not anymore. His Transit Authority supervisor, who'd arrived while Kevin was still explaining the footage, stepped forward with a folder. Termination papers. Pending criminal investigation. Evidence tampering. Filing false reports. Witness coaching. The charges were specific enough to echo in the bus shelter like an indictment. "You had a decorated combat veteran dying on your property," the supervisor said, and her voice carried the kind of disgust that was far worse than anger, "and you threatened the person saving his life. Then you fabricated evidence to destroy her career." She looked at Mercer like he was something that had drifted in on the wind. "You're done here." Mercer opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "I didn't know she was." "You didn't care who she was," the supervisor cut him off, and the finality in her tone was absolute. "That's the problem." The news van pulled up across the street, cameras already rolling. Someone had called ahead. The story was about to become very, very public. Laura watched Mercer process this, watched him understand that his entire world had inverted in approximately 14 minutes, and that there was nothing in his power to invert it back. She didn't smile. She didn't show anything at all. That was the thing about having survived what she had survived. Triumph was something you felt internally, if you felt it at all. The external response was simply to turn back to what mattered. The Route 15 pulled up to the curb. The doors hissed open like a punctuation mark. Laura looked at Sophie, at Marcus, at General Vance with her salute still waiting to be acknowledged. She looked at the young Marine who'd read the citations with tears in his eyes. She looked at Kevin Chen, who understood that sometimes the real war happened in databases and deleted files and the kind of courage it took to tell the truth to people who didn't want to hear it. Then she boarded the bus, and everyone except Mercer, who stood alone at the bus stop with his termination papers and his suspended pension and his future stretching out in front of him like a road with no exit ramps, followed her on. The bus pulled away. Through the windows, the city slid past in shades of grey and November light. Laura sat in the third row, her hand resting on the inside of her jacket, feeling the faded unit patch still sewn there, still hidden, still real. Some truths, she thought, took time to surface. But once they did, they changed everything. Sophie squeezed her hand. Marcus made a soft sound of contentment from the row behind them. And outside, as the bus rounded the corner onto Spee Boulevard, Kevin Chen was already uploading the security footage to the police department's evidence server, making sure that everything that had been deleted would be recovered, that every lie would be documented, that every consequence would follow the shape of the truth. The investigation that followed consumed the next 6 months. Mercer's pension was suspended pending criminal charges. His supervisor found years of similar complaints, people he'd targeted, civilians he'd resented for having respect without official authority to back it up. His edited witness statements fell apart when investigators re-interviewed the teenagers, who admitted under oath that Mercer had told them what to say in exchange for dropping a traffic citation. The hospital reviewed the case and discovered that every single charge against Laura had been built on fabrications, on selective editing, on the kind of careful documentation that was actually just careful lying. Metro General reinstated Laura with a formal apology and back pay. The Transit Authority suspended Mercer pending criminal investigation. His attorney advised him to take a plea agreement, but Mercer chose instead to fight, to insist that he'd been doing his job, enforcing regulations, maintaining order. At a hearing, he stood in front of a panel that included a veteran hearing officer who'd spent 22 years in the Army Nurse Corps. "I was just enforcing the regulations," Mercer said, and his voice had the desperate quality again, the sound of someone trying to explain something that couldn't be explained. "I was doing my job." She had no right to perform medical procedures on Transit Authority property without authorization. "I had a responsibility to." The hearing officer cut him off with a look that was clinical in its precision. "You had a decorated combat veteran dying on your property and you threatened the person saving his life. You then fabricated evidence to destroy her career because she had done what you should have done." "I didn't know she was." "You didn't care who she was," the officer said. "That's the only part of this that's clear. And that's why you're done." Mercer was terminated. Criminal charges for evidence tampering and filing false reports. Community service, driving a medical supply van for 3 hospitals across Denver, delivering bedpans and gauze and oxygen tanks, the kind of work that nobody noticed, the kind of work that required no authority and offered no respect. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.